The money appeared in my account at exactly 8:14 on a rainy Monday morning, and by sunset, I realized my parents had already erased me from the family. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, waiting for my coffee maker to finish dripping into an old ceramic mug my late husband had bought me during a trip to Vermont nearly 20 years ago. The house was quiet except for the steady tapping of rain against the windows and the low hum of my refrigerator. At 67, I had grown used to silence. Silence after widowhood feels different. It settles into the walls. It lingers in the corners of every room. I picked up my phone when I heard the notification sound, expecting another pharmacy reminder or discount coupon from the grocery store. Instead, I saw a bank alert. Deposit received, $11,327.16. My first thought was that the bank had made a mistake. I stared at the number for several long seconds while steam curled from my coffee cup beside me. The memo line underneath the deposit made my stomach tighten. Inheritance settlement distribution. I read it again. Then again. My inheritance. The words didn't feel real. My parents were both still alive. My grandfather's property had never officially been discussed after his funeral 2 years earlier. At least not with me. I slowly sat down at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I used to help my son with homework decades ago, before he moved to Arizona and built a life too busy for weekly phone calls. Outside, rainwater slid down the glass in crooked silver lines. My hands suddenly felt cold. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, owned nearly 40 acres of land outside Asheville, North Carolina. Most people would have seen only old pasture fences and a worn farmhouse sitting at the edge of the hills. But to me, that land held every memory that still felt safe. Summers catching fireflies in mason jars. Homemade peach cobbler cooling on the windowsill. My grandfather teaching me how to cast a fishing line into Miller Creek before sunrise. When I was 13, he once placed his rough hand on my shoulder and told me quietly, "One day, this land will protect you, Evelyn." He never said things he didn't mean. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Hello, Mom," I said carefully. "I just received money from something called an inheritance settlement." There was silence on the other end. Not confusion, not surprise. Silence. Then she sighed softly, almost impatiently. "We assumed Daniel explained everything already." My grip tightened around the phone. Explained what? Another pause. I could hear dishes clinking somewhere in the background. "Your father and Daniel handled the sale months ago, Evelyn. The property taxes were getting expensive and the developer made a generous offer. It was time." I felt the room tilt slightly around me. "You sold Grandpa's land." "Well, yes." Her voice sharpened a little. "You received your portion, didn't you?" "My portion. $11,000. For land worth millions." I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. The rain outside seemed louder now, almost violent against the roof. "Mom," I finally whispered, "I never signed anything." This time, her silence lasted too long. Long enough for me to understand something before she even answered. Something had happened behind my back. Something deliberate. And somewhere between the bank transfer and my mother's cold, tired voice, I realized my family had already decided I no longer belonged at the table. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather standing near the fence line behind his farmhouse with his old denim jacket and weathered work gloves, staring across those rolling hills like they were part of him. The Bennett property was not just land. It was history. It was where 4 generations of my family had buried dogs, planted gardens, argued over supper, celebrated Christmas mornings, and watched thunderstorms roll across the Carolina mountains from the front porch swing. By sunrise, I was sitting alone in my living room wrapped in a faded gray cardigan, listening to the local weather report while a half-finished cup of coffee went cold beside me. My mother had not called back. Neither had my father. Neither had Daniel. That silence told me more than words ever could. I started thinking about all the little things I had ignored over the past 2 years. The family group messages that suddenly stopped including me. The awkward pauses whenever I asked about the property taxes after Grandpa died. The way Daniel always answered questions for our parents before they could speak for themselves. At the time, I convinced myself it was because everybody was grieving differently. Now it felt like I had been watching a play where everyone knew the script except me. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I opened an old photo album I had not touched in years. Dust clung to the corners of the leather cover. Inside were faded photographs of summers in Asheville. There was one picture of me at 16 standing beside Grandpa Walter near Miller Creek, holding a fishing pole almost taller than I was. He looked proud in that quiet way older men sometimes do when they are not good at saying emotional things out loud. I ran my fingers carefully across the photo. Daniel had never cared about that land. Not really. To him, it was always just acreage, investment potential, future development. Even when we were children, he complained about spending summers there because there was no air conditioning and the internet service barely worked. Meanwhile, I loved every inch of it. I loved the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through open windows. I loved the sound of cicadas after dark and the old screen door slamming shut after dinner. My grandfather knew that, which was why none of this made sense. Around noon, I finally checked the transaction details attached to the deposit. The money had come from a real estate escrow company in Charlotte. There was a reference number attached to the file. I wrote it down carefully on the back of an electric bill envelope while my heart pounded harder with every second. Then I noticed something else. The settlement distribution listed me as having confirmed electronic consent 6 months earlier. I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred together. Electronic consent. I had never signed anything electronically in my life beyond doctor forms and grocery deliveries. My hands began trembling so badly that I had to place the paper back on the table. Someone had approved the sale pretending to be me. I suddenly remembered a strange conversation from last Thanksgiving when Melissa casually asked whether I still used the same email password I had for years because she wanted to help me organize family photos online. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Melissa always acted helpful in front of other people. Sweet voice, perfect smile, expensive cream-colored sweaters that somehow never wrinkled. But there was always something rehearsed about her kindness, something polished and cold underneath it. I slowly stood up and walked toward the hallway closet where I kept old family documents in a plastic storage bin. Tax forms, birth certificates, insurance records. At the very bottom sat a faded manila folder labeled Bennett Property. I carried it back to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside was a photocopy of my grandfather's original handwritten will, and clipped to the back was a note in his handwriting that made my chest tighten instantly. Evelyn will understand what this land truly means. The next morning, I drove downtown to the Franklin County Records office with my grandfather's folder resting on the passenger seat beside me like something fragile. The rain had stopped overnight, but the sky still hung low and gray above Columbus, making the city look washed out and tired. I parked beside a row of delivery trucks and sat in the car for a moment with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Part of me still hoped there had been some misunderstanding buried underneath all of this. Some clerical mistake. Some paperwork confusion that could still be untangled. But deep down, another part of me already knew the truth. Families do not accidentally remove someone from a multi-million-dollar land sale. They plan it quietly, one conversation at a time. Inside the records office, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while people waited in plastic chairs holding folders and envelopes. The building smelled faintly like printer toner and old paper. I walked up to the counter and handed the clerk the escrow reference number from my bank statement. She typed for several seconds without speaking. Then her expression changed slightly. Not dramatic, just enough for me to notice. This property transaction closed 6 months ago, she said. Do you need copies of the release documents? My throat felt dry. Yes, I answered softly. She disappeared through a side door and returned carrying a thick packet clipped together at the corner. I thanked her and sat down near the window beneath an American flag hanging crooked against the wall. Outside, a city bus groaned to a stop while people hurried along the sidewalk carrying umbrellas. Meanwhile, my entire family history sat in my lap, reduced to legal paperwork. I opened the packet slowly. There were signatures from my father, my mother, Daniel, and several county approvals. Then I reached the final consent page. My name stared back at me in neat electronic cursive. Evelyn Marie Carter. I froze. It looked close enough to fool a stranger, but I knew instantly it was not mine. The letters curved too carefully. Too perfect. I always pressed harder on the last name because of arthritis in my right hand. Whoever signed this had practiced. Beneath the signature was an email confirmation tied to an address I had not used in almost 3 years. My stomach dropped. Melissa had helped me recover that old account last Thanksgiving after I told her I could not remember the password. I remembered sitting at Daniel's kitchen island while she smiled and typed quickly on her laptop, insisting she would organize old family photos for everybody as a Christmas surprise. At the time, my mother called her an angel for helping with technology. Now I understood why Melissa had asked so many security questions while pretending to be casual about it. Favorite teacher. Childhood pet. Street where I grew up. She had not been helping me. She had been building access to me piece by piece. I kept turning pages. The property had sold for $2.8 million to a luxury resort developer based in Charlotte. My official share after taxes and administrative distribution adjustments had somehow become barely over $11,000. Daniel's share alone was listed at nearly $800,000. My chest tightened so sharply I had to lower the papers into my lap for a moment. It was not just greed that hurt. It was the realization that this had required cooperation. My father had signed. My mother had signed. They had all sat together somewhere discussing how to remove me from my own inheritance while still smiling at me during birthdays and holiday dinners. I suddenly remembered Easter dinner 4 months earlier when my father barely looked at me across the table while Daniel talked endlessly about real estate investments in North Carolina. At one point, Melissa had raised her wine glass and said, "Some properties are more valuable once you finally let go of sentimentality." Everybody laughed except me because I had not understood the joke yet. Sitting there in that records office, surrounded by strangers shuffling paperwork under cold fluorescent lights, I finally realized my family had been speaking around the truth for months while I stood in the middle of it completely alone. I drove home in complete silence with the folder sitting beside me on the passenger seat like evidence from a crime nobody intended me to discover. Traffic moved slowly through downtown Columbus while afternoon clouds darkened the sky again, but I barely noticed any of it. My mind kept replaying small moments from the past 2 years that suddenly looked different now. Memories I once dismissed as awkward family dynamics had started rearranging themselves into something colder and far more deliberate. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were trembling again. I carried the documents inside and placed them carefully across my dining room table beneath the soft yellow light hanging overhead. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder than normal. Tick, tick, tick. Like time itself was mocking me for not seeing this sooner. I sat there for nearly an hour reading every page again. Each signature, each transfer amount, every legal sentence written in clean professional language that somehow made betrayal feel official. My father had authorized Daniel as primary family representative less than 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. My mother had approved distribution adjustments shortly afterward. Nobody had even attempted to contact me directly. Not once. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, remembering the day of my grandfather's funeral in Asheville. Daniel had stood near the cemetery smiling politely at distant relatives, while Melissa moved quietly between groups carrying bottled water and tissues like the perfect supportive wife. Meanwhile, I stayed beside Grandma's old church friends listening to stories about Grandpa teaching Sunday school and fixing neighbors' tractors for free. At one point, Grandpa's attorney, Mr. Hargrove, had approached me near the graveside. He was already in his 70s, then with silver hair and heavy glasses that always slid down his nose. I remembered him squeezing my shoulder gently and saying, "Walter trusted you more than you realize, Evelyn." At the time, grief had swallowed everything else. I barely thought about the comment afterward. Now those words returned to me with sharp clarity. I suddenly stood up and walked back to the hallway closet where I kept older address books and Christmas cards stacked in storage boxes. Somewhere near the bottom, I found a faded envelope from nearly 3 years ago with Mr. Hargrove's business cards still tucked inside. The law office was based in Asheville. My heart began pounding harder as I stared at the number. It was nearly 6 in the evening, but I called anyway. To my surprise, someone answered after the second ring. "Hargrove and Associates." "My name is Evelyn Carter," I said carefully. "I do not know if Mr. Hargrove still remembers me. My grandfather was Walter Bennett." There was a brief pause. Papers shuffled softly on the other end. Then the receptionist's tone changed slightly. "One moment, please." A minute later, an older man's familiar voice came through the line. Slower now, rougher with age, but unmistakable. "Evelyn." Hearing my name in his voice almost broke something inside me. "Mr. Hargrove," I whispered. "I think my family sold Grandpa's land without my consent." Silence filled the line for several long seconds. Not surprised silence. Confirming silence. Finally, he exhaled heavily. I was afraid this day might come. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You knew? Your grandfather suspected there would be pressure after his death," he said quietly. "Especially from Daniel." My chest tightened. Outside, thunder rolled low across the evening sky, while rain began tapping lightly against the windows again. "There is something you need to see, Evelyn," Mr. Hargrove continued. "Something your grandfather instructed me to release only if the property was ever transferred improperly." I closed my eyes slowly as cold realization settled through me like winter air. My grandfather had known they might betray me long before I ever imagined it myself. 2 days later, I drove to Asheville with a small overnight bag in the trunk and my grandfather's folder resting beside me again like a silent passenger. The highway stretched for miles beneath a pale October sky while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. I barely listened. My thoughts stayed fixed on one question the entire drive. How long had my family been planning this? Every mile south felt like I was driving backward through my own life. Past memories. Past trust. Past the version of myself that still believed blood automatically meant loyalty. By the time I reached Asheville, the sun was beginning to lower behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the hills. The city looked almost unchanged from my childhood visits. Small coffee shops, brick storefronts, church steeples rising above tree-lined streets. For a brief moment, I could almost pretend none of this had happened. Mr. Hargrove's office sat inside an older brick building near downtown with dark wooden doors and brass lettering that looked untouched since the 1980s. When I stepped inside, the familiar smell of paper, leather furniture, and coffee hit me immediately. The receptionist smiled softly and guided me toward a private office near the back. Mr. Hargrove stood slowly when I entered. Age had bent his shoulders slightly since I last saw him, but his eyes remained sharp behind thick glasses. He shook my hand. With both of his. "You look just like your grandmother when she was upset," he said quietly. Somehow that nearly made me cry more than everything else combined. He motioned for me to sit. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Outside the office window, leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk in the afternoon wind. Finally, he opened a locked drawer in his desk and removed a large sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. My chest tightened the second I saw it. Walter Bennett's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right, strong and deliberate, like every word mattered. I reached for the envelope carefully. "He left instructions," Mr. Hargrove said. "Very specific instructions." I looked up at him. "What kind of instructions?" He folded his hands together slowly. "Walter amended his estate documents 6 months before he passed away. He believed certain family members might attempt to pressure the sale of the property after his death, especially if land developers became involved." I stared at him without speaking. Mr. Hargrove continued carefully, almost reluctantly. "Your grandfather was concerned that your parents had become too financially dependent on Daniel and Melissa over the years. He worried decisions would stop being about family and start being about money." I lowered my eyes toward the envelope in my hands. Somehow hearing someone else confirm it made everything hurt more deeply. "Why did nobody tell me?" I asked quietly. Mr. Hargrove sighed heavily. "Because Walter did not want conflict while he was alive. And after his death, your father insisted everything would be handled fairly." The room fell silent again. Fairly. That word almost sounded cruel now. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside sat several notarized documents clipped neatly together along with a handwritten letter folded at the center. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, then somebody ignored my wishes." I had to stop for a second because the words blurred beneath my eyes. I pressed my lips together and kept reading silently while the office around me disappeared. "Your heart has always belonged to this land. That matters more than money ever will. If the property is sold without your direct written consent witnessed by legal counsel, all proceeds connected to your inheritance rights are to be frozen immediately and redirected into the Bennett Family Preservation Trust solely under your authority." I slowly looked up from the letter. Mr. Hargrove watched me quietly across the desk. "Does Daniel know about this?" I whispered. Mr. Hargrove gave a slow shake of his head. No. And based on the paperwork you showed me, I believe your family assumed these documents were destroyed after Walter died. Outside the office window, the mountains stood dark against the evening sky, while something inside me shifted for the first time since this nightmare began. Not anger, not grief, something colder. Clarity. I stayed that night in a small hotel just outside downtown Asheville, where the carpet smelled faintly like detergent and old air conditioning. The room overlooked a parking lot lit by flickering yellow lights, and somewhere nearby an ice machine rattled every few minutes through the thin walls. I should have been exhausted after the drive and everything I had learned, but sleep never came. Instead, I sat at the small table near the window with Grandpa's letter spread open in front of me beneath a dim lamp, while the television played silently in the background. I read his words over and over until I nearly memorized them. Your heart has always belonged to this land. At around midnight, I finally called my son, Michael, in Arizona. We had grown distant over the years in the quiet, ordinary way families sometimes drift apart after marriages, careers, and different states slowly build separate lives. But hearing his voice that night grounded me in a way I did not expect. Mom, he answered sleepily. Everything okay? I stared out at the empty parking lot below before answering. No, I admitted softly. I do not think it is. For the next 20 minutes, I told him everything. The forged consent forms, the land sale, the trust documents, the letter from Grandpa. Michael stayed silent most of the time except for a few sharp breaths whenever another detail surfaced. Finally he muttered quietly, Jesus, Mom. I almost laughed at the bitterness in his voice because it sounded so much like my late husband whenever something disappointed him deeply. I knew Uncle Daniel was selfish, Michael continued, but I did not think Grandma and Grandpa would go along with something like this. Neither did I. That was the part still cutting deepest beneath everything else. Not Daniel. Not Melissa. My parents. I thought about my mother teaching me to bake peach pie as a little girl while old country music played through the kitchen radio. My father carrying me on his shoulders at county fairs when I was too small to see over crowds. Those memories now sat beside legal documents proving they had quietly removed me from my own family inheritance. Human beings are strange that way. Love and betrayal somehow manage to exist inside the same memory. What are you going to do? Michael finally asked. I looked down at the stack of paperwork in front of me. Earlier that evening, Mr. Hargrove had explained everything carefully. Because the land sale violated the amended trust protections, the distribution of proceeds could legally be challenged immediately. Funds connected to the transaction were still partially frozen during final development processing. Daniel apparently did not know that yet. None of them did. I am not sure, I answered honestly. Part of me wants to disappear and never speak to any of them again. Michael was quiet for a moment. Grandpa trusted you for a reason, Mom. Those words lingered long after our call ended. The next morning, I drove past the old Bennett property before leaving town. Construction fencing now surrounded most of the land. Bright orange markers stood across the hills where bulldozers would eventually reshape everything into luxury vacation homes and private rental cabins. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and sat there watching the morning fog drift across the fields. For a moment, I could almost still see Grandpa standing near the barn with a coffee mug in his hand while hounds barked somewhere in the distance. Then a pickup truck carrying construction equipment rolled through the front gate and shattered the illusion completely. The land was already disappearing. I lowered my window slightly and breathed in the cold mountain air one last time. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Dinner at our place Saturday night. Big family news to celebrate. Hope you can make it this time. I stared at the message for several long seconds before another text appeared beneath it from Daniel. You finally got your payout. Drinks are on you now. I looked back toward the fenced-off hills while something inside me settled into place with perfect calm. They thought the story was already over. They had no idea I was carrying the final chapter inside my purse. Saturday evening arrived cold and windy, the kind of October night where dry leaves scrape across sidewalks like whispers following you home. I parked outside Daniel and Melissa's house just after 6:30 and sat in the car for a moment watching warm yellow lights spill through their front windows. From outside, everything looked perfect. Expensive SUVs lined the driveway. Decorative lanterns glowed beside the front steps. Somewhere inside, people laughed. It struck me how easy it is for betrayal to hide inside beautiful homes. I picked up my purse carefully, making sure the envelope from Mr. Hargrove rested securely inside beside the trust documents, then stepped out into the cold evening air. Melissa opened the door before I even knocked. "Evelyn," she said brightly, leaning forward to hug me lightly with practiced warmth. Her cream-colored sweater probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "You made it." Her perfume smelled expensive and floral. I smiled politely. Of course. Inside, the dining room looked like something from a magazine advertisement. Candles flickered down the center of the long table beside polished wine glasses and neatly folded linen napkins. My mother sat near the far end wearing a soft blue cardigan, while my father poured bourbon into crystal glasses beside Daniel. Nobody looked guilty. That was what unsettled me most. They looked comfortable, relaxed, like people who believed their secret was safely buried. "There she is," Daniel announced with a grin when he saw me. "The rich heiress finally arrives." Everyone laughed lightly except my mother, who lowered her eyes toward her plate almost immediately. I took my seat quietly beside my father. He smelled faintly like aftershave and whiskey, the same combination I associated with every holiday dinner from my childhood. For a brief moment, sadness hit me so suddenly it almost stole my breath. I missed who I thought my family was. Melissa carried roasted chicken and vegetables from the kitchen, while soft jazz played through hidden speakers somewhere in the house. The conversation drifted between vacation plans, real estate investments, and a new luxury condo Daniel wanted to purchase in Charleston. Every topic somehow circled back toward money, success, appearances. At one point, Daniel raised his glass and smiled toward me. "To family prosperity," he said proudly. "Grandpa's land finally paid off." My father chuckled quietly while Melissa added, "Walter would have wanted everybody to move forward instead of clinging to old memories forever." I watched the candlelight flicker across their faces while something inside me became perfectly still. They really believed they had won. My mother finally looked at me then, her expression nervous around the edges. "Evelyn," she said softly, "we know this transition has probably been emotional for you." Emotional. Such a careful word. Not fraudulent. Not dishonest. Not cruel. Just emotional. I folded my napkin slowly onto the table beside my untouched food. "Actually," I said calmly, "I drove to Asheville this week." The room changed instantly. Small changes. Tiny changes most people would miss. My father stopped reaching for his drink. Daniel's smile tightened slightly. Melissa blinked once too quickly before forcing another smile onto her face. "Oh," she asked carefully. "What for?" I looked directly at her. "I met with Mr. Hargrove." Silence spread slowly across the table like spilled ink. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Daniel laughed too loudly. "That old lawyer is probably 90 years old by now." 78, I corrected softly. "And his memory is excellent." My father stared down at the tablecloth while my mother's hands trembled faintly around her wine glass. Melissa recovered first. She leaned back calmly and crossed her arms. "Well," she said coolly, "I am sure he explained the property was legally transferred months ago." I reached into my purse carefully and removed the sealed envelope containing Grandpa's amended trust documents. Then I placed it gently at the center of the dinner table beside the candles. The entire room went quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming somewhere in the kitchen. "Not exactly," I said. Daniel reached for the envelope first, but I placed my hand gently over it before he could touch it. The movement was calm, quiet, yet somehow it stopped the entire room. Candlelight flickered across the polished dining table while nobody spoke. Even the jazz music drifting from the speakers seemed distant now, like it belonged to another house entirely. "You forged my consent," I said softly. Not accusing, not emotional, just factual. Melissa let out a short, nervous laugh and leaned back in her chair. "That is a ridiculous accusation." I looked at her steadily. "You used my old email account to approve the transfer documents." My father finally spoke then, his voice low and strained. "Evelyn, maybe this is not the time for legal discussions." I almost smiled at that. Legal discussions. As though they had not quietly turned my grandfather's legacy into a business transaction months earlier. "Actually," I replied calmly, "this is exactly the time." I slowly opened the envelope and removed the notarized trust amendment Mr. Hargrove had given me in Asheville. The paper itself looked ordinary. White pages. Black ink. but the effect it had on the room was immediate. My mother's face lost color almost instantly. Daniel's confident posture stiffened. Melissa stopped smiling altogether. Grandpa amended the trust 6 months before he died. I explained quietly. If the property was ever sold without my direct witnessed consent, all proceeds tied to my inheritance rights were to be frozen and redirected into the Bennett Family Preservation Trust under my sole authority. Nobody moved. Daniel stared at me for several seconds before scoffing too quickly. That is impossible. No, I answered. Forgery is impossible to defend once attorneys become involved. The silence afterward felt enormous. My father rubbed his forehead slowly like a man realizing a storm had already reached the house before he boarded the windows. Evelyn, he muttered carefully. We thought everything had already been handled. I turned toward him for the first time that evening. Handled? I repeated softly. Is that what you call removing your daughter from her own inheritance? He could not meet my eyes. That hurt more than anger would have. Melissa suddenly straightened in her chair. You still received money, she snapped. More than enough considering you were not involved in maintaining the property. There was at last the real voice underneath the polished smile and perfect dinner parties. Cold, sharp, entitled. I looked at her calmly. Grandpa did not leave that land to whoever maintained it. He left it to the person who loved it. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. You are really going to destroy this family over paperwork. I almost laughed then, but the sadness inside me was too heavy. No, Daniel, I said quietly. You already did that when you signed my name for me. Nobody had an answer to that. My mother suddenly began crying softly into her napkin while staring down at the table. Small embarrassed tears. The kind people cry when guilt finally becomes impossible to avoid. We were under pressure, she whispered weakly. The taxes. The developers. Daniel said this was the easiest way. Easiest. Such a small, harmless word for something that required betrayal at every step. I folded the trust documents carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Then I reached into my purse once more and removed another paper Mr. Hargrove had prepared before I left Asheville. What is that? Daniel asked sharply. A temporary injunction request already filed yesterday morning. I answered. The remaining proceeds from the sale are frozen until the fraud investigation is complete. For the first time all night, Daniel looked genuinely frightened. Not angry. Frightened. Melissa's face went pale beside him while my father closed his eyes. Completely like a man too exhausted to survive the consequences of his own choices. Outside, cold wind rattled against the dining room windows while the candles burned quietly between us. And sitting there at that beautiful polished table surrounded by people who once called themselves my family, I realized something strange. I was no longer heartbroken. Just finished. The lawyers handled most of the collapse quietly over the next 3 months. That was the strange thing about legal consequences. Television dramas make everything loud and explosive, but in real life, families usually fall apart through phone calls that stop coming, bank accounts that freeze overnight, and long silences nobody knows how to repair. Mr. Hargrove worked alongside a fraud investigator hired by the title company handling the development sale. Once the forged electronic consent forms were traced back through Melissa's computer records and the unauthorized account recovery requests surfaced, the developers immediately halted the remaining payments connected to the project. Daniel spent weeks trying to call me after that. At first his messages sounded angry, then defensive, then desperate. I listened to none of them. I simply deleted each voicemail one by one while drinking coffee in my quiet kitchen every morning as winter slowly settled over Ohio. My mother attempted handwritten letters instead. 3 in total. The first blamed stress and financial pressure. The second apologized vaguely without ever fully admitting what they had done. The third simply said, I do not recognize this family anymore. Neither did I. My father never wrote at all. Somehow that hurt the most. 2 days before Christmas, Mr. Hargrove called with the final settlement update. Because the amended trust had been legally valid and properly notarized before Grandpa's death, the court approved enforcement without requiring a lengthy public trial. The remaining frozen proceeds connected to my inheritance rights were transferred directly into the Bennett Family Preservation Trust under my sole authority, exactly as Grandpa intended. Daniel lost nearly everything he expected from the sale after legal penalties, and repayment obligations were calculated. Melissa's real estate license was suspended during the fraud investigation. I felt no satisfaction hearing any of it. Just exhaustion. Some victories arrived too late to feel good. By January, snow covered most of Columbus in thick, uneven patches, while gray skies hung low over the city for weeks at a time. One morning, I stood at my living room window watching neighborhood children pull sleds down the sidewalk when my phone rang unexpectedly. It was Michael. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you thought any more about Montana?" Months earlier, before all of this happened, he had mentioned a small lakeside property near Bozeman that reminded him of the stories I used to tell about Grandpa's land. At the time, I dismissed the idea completely. My whole life had been rooted in Ohio. But standing there beside the window while snow drifted quietly across my front yard, I suddenly realized there was very little keeping me here anymore besides memories that no longer felt safe. 2 months later, I packed the last box into my car and left Ohio before sunrise. The drive west took 3 long days across frozen highways, small mountain towns, and endless stretches of pale winter sky. When I finally arrived in Montana, the lake near my new cabin reflected the mountains so clearly it looked almost unreal. The house itself was small, nothing extravagant, just weathered wood siding, a stone fireplace, and a back porch facing the water. Peaceful, honest, mine. That first evening, I sat alone outside wrapped in a heavy blanket while cold wind moved softly through the pine trees around the lake. Somewhere in the distance, I heard water hitting the rocky shoreline in slow, steady rhythm. For the first time in a very long while, the silence around me did not feel lonely. It felt clean. I reached into my coat pocket and unfolded Grandpa's letter one final time beneath the fading light. "Your heart has always belonged to this land." I smiled softly to myself, then looked out across the water as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. My family sold the inheritance behind my back because they thought ownership lived inside signatures and bank transfers. But Grandpa understood something they never did. Some things do not belong to the people who steal them. They belong to the people who protect them. After receiving a mysterious bank deposit tied to her late grandfather's estate, an elderly daughter discovers that her parents and younger brother secretly sold the family land behind her back using forged consent forms and hidden legal documents. What begins as quiet confusion slowly turns into one of the most emotional family stories about betrayal, inheritance, and silence inside an American family. As the elderly mother uncovers years of manipulation orchestrated by her brother and sister-in-law, she realizes the people she trusted most had already erased her from the family long before the paperwork was signed. These family stories reveal how greed can quietly destroy generations of trust while hiding behind holiday dinners, polite smiles, and expensive homes. Guided by an old attorney and a final handwritten letter from her grandfather, the elderly daughter uncovers a forgotten trust amendment that changes everything and exposes the truth her family tried to bury. Filled with emotional twists, inheritance drama, quiet revenge, and realistic legal tension, this is one of those unforgettable family stories that captures the heartbreak of being betrayed by your own blood relatives. Viewers who enjoy emotional family stories about elderly parents, inheritance conflicts, toxic siblings, manipulative daughters-in-law, and slow-burning justice will connect deeply with this powerful story of dignity, grief, and healing. In the end, the elderly daughter learns that real inheritance is not measured by money alone, but by loyalty, memory, and the courage to protect what truly mattered to the grandfather who trusted her from the very beginning. This is one of those deeply human family stories where silence hurts more than anger and where the final truth changes an entire family forever. If you enjoy emotional family stories filled with betrayal, inheritance secrets, emotional healing, and realistic American family drama, this story delivers a powerful and unforgettable journey from heartbreak to peace. Character 1. A 67-year-old white American woman with silver shoulder-length hair and tired blue eyes, wearing a soft gray cardigan and modest, elegant clothing. Front-facing portrait. Natural indoor lighting. Realistic skin texture. Emotional expression. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Character 2. A 42-year-old white American woman with polished blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and controlled expression, wearing an expensive cream-colored sweater and subtle jewelry. Front-facing portrait. Elegant appearance. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 1. Cinematic dramatic confrontation inside a luxurious American suburban dining room at night. A 67-year-old white American woman with silver shoulder-length hair, wearing a soft gray cardigan, stands calmly beside a candlelit wooden dining table covered with legal documents and envelopes. Across from her stands a 42-year-old white American woman with polished blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and an elegant cream-colored sweater. The younger woman looks tense and defensive while the older woman remains emotionally controlled and quietly powerful. Elderly parents and a middle-aged man sit frozen in shock in the background. Rain streaks across large dining room windows. Warm candlelight mixed with cold blue storm lighting creates emotional tension. Realistic cinematic photography. Emotional eye contact. Expensive home interior. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Ultra-realistic American family drama atmosphere. 122. Quiet emotional morning scene inside a modest Ohio suburban kitchen during heavy rain outside the windows. A 67-year-old white American woman with tired blue eyes and silver shoulder-length hair sits alone at a wooden kitchen table, holding a ceramic coffee mug beside scattered old family photographs, legal papers, and handwritten notes. She wears a soft gray cardigan and simple, elegant clothing. Her expression shows heartbreak, reflection, and emotional exhaustion, while soft, natural window light falls across her face. The kitchen feels lonely but realistic with muted colors, old cabinets, and subtle American middle-class details. Steam rises from coffee beside. Faded photo albums and unopened letters. Cinematic framing focused on emotional isolation and dignity. Realistic skin texture and mature facial details. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Authentic emotional realism and quiet dramatic atmosphere. 1, 2, 3. Elegant upper-middle-class suburban kitchen at night, with modern marble countertops, expensive wine glasses, and luxury American interior design. A 42-year-old white American woman with polished blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and subtle makeup stands beside a laptop with a carefully controlled smile, hiding emotional tension underneath. She wears a fitted cream-colored sweater, delicate jewelry, and stylish neutral tones. Her eyes appear calculating and emotionally distant, while soft golden kitchen lighting reflects across the room. The atmosphere feels polished, cold, and manipulative. Cinematic realism with realistic skin texture and expressive facial detail. Background includes upscale cabinets, decorative lighting, and expensive modern furniture. Quiet emotional unease beneath a perfect suburban appearance. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. High detail cinematic photography with realistic American family drama energy. 1, 2, 4. Intense cinematic confrontation inside an American county records office filled with paperwork, fluorescent lights, and government office desks. A 67-year-old white American woman with silver shoulder-length hair stands firmly holding thick legal documents while facing a 42-year-old white American woman with polished blonde hair and a tense expression. A middle-aged man appears angry beside the younger woman, while elderly parents sit silently in emotional discomfort behind them. Paper folders, property records, and legal forms spread across a government desk. The older woman appears calm, emotionally wounded, but quietly strong, while the younger woman shows hidden panic beneath a controlled appearance. Realistic office environment with cold lighting, muted colors, and dramatic emotional tension. Cinematic realism with detailed expressions and realistic American atmosphere. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 1, 2, 5. Emotional cinematic landscape scene in the North Carolina mountains during late autumn. A 67-year-old white American woman with silver shoulder-length hair stands alone near an old rural family property, surrounded by construction fencing, bulldozers, and heavy machinery in the distance. She wears a long gray coat and holds a handwritten letter close to her chest, while staring across rolling hills covered with orange leaves and fading grass. Wind moves through her hair and clothing, creating a feeling of grief, loneliness, and quiet determination. The atmosphere feels deeply emotional and realistic, with dramatic cloudy skies and fading evening light across the mountains. The destroyed family land contrasts against her fragile emotional state. Realistic cinematic photography with detailed natural scenery and emotional realism. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 126. Peaceful cinematic ending beside a quiet Montana lake during sunset. A 67-year-old white American woman with silver shoulder-length hair sits wrapped in a warm blanket on the wooden porch of a small lakeside cabin. A folded handwritten letter rests beside a steaming coffee mug on a small table near her chair. Calm lake water reflects distant mountains, pine trees, and golden sunset light. Her expression is peaceful, thoughtful, and emotionally healed after betrayal and loss. The rustic cabin atmosphere feels warm, simple, and authentic with realistic American wilderness details. Soft wind moves through the trees while golden light falls across her face and the surrounding landscape. Emotional cinematic realism focused on peace, dignity, and survival. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon.